Hi, one of the topics I get asked the most about is composting. And today we're setting up a hot compost, so I thought it was a perfect opportunity to record a video for you all to give you a bit of an understanding of composting. Hot composting, as the name suggests, is a compost heap that generates heat. And that heat is beneficial for a few things. The heat accelerates the composting process, so it breaks down a lot more quickly. It should break down in 10 to 12 weeks in optimum conditions. The heat's also useful because it will kill a lot of the weed seeds that are in the compost, meaning that when you then put that compost onto your garden, you're not likely to be introducing lots of weed seeds to the garden. And the final reason the heat from hot composting is great is that it also can help kill pathogens that might be harmful to your plants. Now, when you're setting up a hot compost system, there's a couple of rules that you should follow. The first is that you need a minimum of a cubic metre of space. Now, that cubic metre of volume of hot compost is important because any smaller and the heat will dissipate too quickly. Ideally, your hot compost will get to 65 to 70 degrees, and to enable it to do that, you need that minimum of a cubic metre of volume. Another rule about hot composting is that you set it all up at once. You don't add to it slowly over time. So we do actually have a compost bay over here where we do add weeds to periodically, but that's a cold compost. It never generates the heat that's required. Hot composting, you have all your materials set up like we do today, and you add them all together in one day and set the process up. Another rule of hot composting is that you need lots of water on it. So when you get set up, you're going to need to make sure you've got a hose ready with somebody to be watering that compost as you go. And your final rule is to get your carbon and nitrogen ratios correct. Now, most things that are living are made up of predominantly carbon and nitrogen. And when most living things die and start to decompose, they need to be in the right ratios, otherwise they won't decompose properly. So hot composting is all about setting up layers of carbon, then layers of nitrogen, layers of carbon. But you need to know what's high in carbon and what's high in nitrogen. So there's lots of tables that you can look up on the internet. However, you can just do what I like to call the stinky test. And that's basically, imagine you've got a bucket of water, you add a handful of the material that you're thinking of adding to your compost to, and leave it for a week. Now, you can actually physically do this, or you can just imagine it. Probably better just to imagine it in some cases. And what that will do after a week, come back and if it smells, it's probably high in nitrogen. If it doesn't smell, it's probably high in carbon. So imagine you've got a bucket of fish heads and you leave them in a bucket of water for a week, come back, it's going to reek, and that's because it's high in nitrogen. Add a block of wood to a bucket of water and come back in a week, it's probably not going to smell, and that's because it's high in carbon. So some of the materials that we've got with us here today that we're going to be adding to our compost, we've got a bag of weeds that we've taken out of the garden, mostly green, that's going to be high in nitrogen. We've got some clippings here of plants like buddleia, mock orange, lavender, rosemary. They weren't particularly woody, so we've got quite a few sticks through it, but there was a lot of leaf matter on it as well. So that's probably a good balance of carbon and nitrogen. We've got some old corn stalks here from last summer. We're going to be laying them down in the bottom of the compost heap just to help improve airflow. They're predominantly going to be carbon. We've got a few wool bales of straw over here. That straw is predominantly carbon but should break down nice and easily, and that's going to form one of the main bases of our hot compost today. You can use things such as cardboard, which is pretty high in carbon. You can add veggie scraps. I wouldn't add veggie scraps to a normal cold compost because it's going to attract a lot of rodents and rats, but adding it to the centre of a hot compost, hopefully they'll break down quickly enough for them not to be found. We've got lots of chook manure, and we cleaned out the chook pen yesterday, so there's bits of straw with chook manure through it, lots of grasses and weeds. Now chook manure is very high in nitrogen compared to a lot of mammal manures, and that's because the poo and the wee comes out the same hole basically, whereas cow manure is a lot lower in nitrogen. However, a lot of this chook manure has been sitting around for a while, so a lot of the nitrogen might have already disappeared. As I said, a hot compost can kill weed seeds and things, and in theory it should kill a lot of the invasive grasses and weedy plants. However, I'm always a bit, I take a cautious approach to this. So things like wandering trad, or a climbing ficus or couch grass, I'll add to a bin, and I'll put some bricks on the top to weigh it down and fill it up with water. And what that pretty much does is drowns the weeds. So in theory, most of the weeds that were in here should be dead, but just to doubly make sure, I'm going to add it to the centre of the hot compost to further cook them before we add them back to the garden. This avoids the need to have to put those materials into a green waste bin and effectively waste them. We've got our Bokashi compost system that we use for bones and citrus, that are no good for our worm farm and things. We've got that here. Now that shouldn't ever be added straight to your garden. That should always be composted again because it's so acidic. So we're going to be adding that to our hot compost. And I also went last week down to the local racing stables, and I picked up bags and bags and bags of stable manure. Now this is predominantly horse manure, which again I would never use straight on the garden because it's full of weed seeds. However, we're going to add it to our hot compost. It's also got a lot of wood chip material in here, so it's likely that the carbon and nitrogen ratios in this are pretty even. So again, you could probably just pile this up if you had a cubic metre of it, and it would break down pretty quickly. So we're going to be setting this up today, putting down lots of layers, adding water to it as we go. We'll do a bit of a time lapse so that you can see us as we go through, get an idea of how we put it all together, and then we'll come back for another quick chat at the end. Thanks. Right, that's over. Right, so you will have noticed as we were making that compost that we were watering it all the time. And that's because you want the moisture content to be quite high of all the materials. So you want them so that actually you can wring a bit of water out of them. And that will help speed up the decomposition process. Now I'm asked often, when should you turn your compost? The idea of turning your hot compost is to, one, ensure that all the materials get broken down evenly, otherwise you get a hard crust on there of materials that don't break down on the outside. And the other is to stop it getting too hot, because a hot compost can actually, it can get beyond the 65-70 degrees that you're after, up to 100 degrees, which is no good for the good bacteria and good fungi in the soil. So it's a good idea to invest in a compost thermometer such as this. So that simply slides into the compost like that and gives you an indication of what the temperature is. And basically when it gets to 65-70 degrees, that's time to turn it. And when you turn it, basically you're taking all the material from the outside and putting it in the center of the pile, and all of what was in the center of the pile goes on the outside. And that should stop the temperature getting higher than 70 degrees. If your hot compost doesn't get to 65-70 degrees, don't turn it. It's not going to speed up the process. Now this compost bay that we've set up in here, it's about 1.8 meters wide, about 2.3 meters long, and about a metre deep. So there's 4 cubic metres of compost here. It's got sides on it that are going to help keep the temperature in with the timber. You don't need to use a timber compost bay like this though. You can just use some chicken wire stretched around to hold everything together, or you could just make a really big pile. Now I'm not going to turn this compost more than likely. I'm not particularly worried about it getting to breaking down all uniformly. What I've done is actually added a good foot of straw on the top here, and that's going to act a bit like a blanket to keep the temperature up. And if it doesn't break down, I'm not that worried. I'm just going to take it all off and use it as mulch in the garden over the summer. But the walls should help keep the temperature up there. It shouldn't really need turning. So I'll just keep an eye on this thermometer here, keep an eye on the temperature as it goes, and hopefully we won't have to turn it. So the last thing for us to do is just to add some signage, just saying that it's hot compost and the date that we've set it up, so that it's our team of interns and everyone else can keep an eye on it, know not to add anything to it, and hopefully in 10 to 12 weeks we'll have some beautiful compost here to add to the garden. My name's Duncan, I'm from Leaf Fruit and Fruit. Thanks for watching.